It is 11 minutes to 10 on Friday, the 12th of June, and I'm here today with another market broadcast. Now, the purpose of these ones on Friday is to look back over the past week and see if there are any interesting stories that our editors would like to share with our listeners. Interesting investing stories or movements in the financial world, which we think our listeners should really be paying attention to as they illustrate what might be coming in the future, or if they illustrate an interesting investment story that we think you should know about. Now, on today's market broadcast, I've got Nickolai Hubble and Kit Winder. Now, Nickolai, what have you seen so far this week that you thought that caught your eye, that you thought our listeners should really be hearing about?
Yeah, I think today's news about the GDP in the UK, the 20% drop in 1 month, which brings, since February, the economy to a loss of more than 25%. That's about 18 years of economic growth wiped out. UK GDP is operating at a monthly level at about the same level it was at in 2002. So this is far worse than the global financial crisis of 2008, both in terms of the shock and where it's left the UK economy since it's happened. But I think there's a very deep misunderstanding that people have about GDP, which leads to a lot of, I guess, unnecessary panic here. And also people misunderstand what is the underlying problem. So it's important to clarify that GDP is a flow, not a stock, meaning it's a measure of activity undertaken. It's not a measure of stuff we have, or assets or companies or employment or things. We don't lose anything. It's just that something didn't happen when GDP drops. And obviously, if you're going to come up with an example of the distinction, it is a lockdown. So if we all sat on our hands for a month, didn't eat anything, didn't drink anything, didn't go anywhere, didn't do anything, then GDP would be 100% gone. But if we get back to a completely normal level of activity the next month, then GDP would be at exactly the level it was at 2 months before that. So the 20% drop is really just a measure of how severe the drop in activity was. And GDP could, theoretically speaking at least, come roaring back to exactly the level it was at before the lockdown began, if the lockdown were, say, lifted and economic activity really did recover that fast.
But is that not assuming that pretty much every business has remained solvent and everybody is still, employed and with enough cash in their pocket from their salary to keep buying things?
That's right. So that's the actual loss that people should be concerned about. Right. And the GDP figure is not revealing that particular type of loss. Included in the 20% drop in UK GDP for the month of April is a mixture of what you've just said. It's economic activity that cannot return quickly. But there's also a big chunk of that is economic activity that will or could return quickly if the lockdown is lifted. And we don't know what proportion of the drop in GDP is of the two different types. And that is the crucial distinction.
Yeah, it does feel like, 20% in terms of sort of total economic activity. I mean, I would, from my own my own life, I would imagine that my activities probably dropped in terms of going out, in terms of spending so much, by more than 20%, by more than a fifth, I would probably say. But Kit, what have you seen this week that you think is worthy of our listeners' attention?
Hey, well, obviously this is the main one as well, and I think, just to continue that conversation, really, one of the interesting things that I seen, it was actually a couple of weeks ago, but I think it was Nike in a quarterly earnings report started talking about something called revenge spending. I don't know if you've heard about this. So the idea is that we've seen how unemployment during the coronavirus has adversely affected people lower down the income scale, because those are jobs that cannot be performed remotely. And so it's actually, and ironically or otherwise, the people who are already better off, who are more able to work from home, and so who are more able to keep their jobs. And those people are actually better off financially in terms of savings. So savings rates are going up at the same time as GDP is going down, because as we know, one person's spending is another person's income. So those two are directly related. But what Nike are hoping for is that all of these people who are able to work from home and who are wealthier already will start to unleash what they're calling revenge spending in order to get, revenues back above where they were before. Because actually, as you say, you've not been going to nice restaurants or going on holidays for the last 3 months. And so people have more disposable income. That's why sort of Waitrose is probably doing a bit better, because the people who used to spend £100 on a nice meal for two at a smart restaurant in central London are now thinking that, spending extra on nice bottles of wine from Waitrose or the most expensive steak or whatever it is, those kind of luxury spending for the people who were already better off, could be a factor as well. And I noticed that Tesla were the best-selling car in March in the UK for the first time ever. Admittedly, while total car sales fell enormously, but that's one thing I could see is like a lot of people with environmental concerns suddenly having more disposable income would be those kind of people who might also buy a Tesla. And so, that disposable cash and that revenge spending could be a factor that does drive what Nickolai mentioned, which is a return to total GDP at some point.
Where exactly does the revenge part come in? Like who's being sort of hurt or being given their just desserts in this revenge spending scenario?
I think it's more just the idea that people have been locking themselves in. All they've been doing is buying groceries. They've been being cautious because they don't want to be reckless with their money. There was so much uncertainty, but as some certainty resumes, also shops have been closed, and how many new I don't know. As you say, like, there's only really been a need to buy food, and like my running trainers died, so I bought another pair, but that was about it. But I don't know, in Nike's world, people who have been saving, as they start to open up and see their friends again, they're going to start thinking like, yeah, I've got a bit more sort of disposable cash to burn. And so the revenge is sort of like, I've been good, I've been saving, and I've got a bit built up now, so I'm going to throw it at the Nike top line.
Right.
Isn't there like a diet, the rest day and the diet is considered like a revenge day or something? I'm sure there's some sort of diet fad that uses the revenge terminology.
I thought it was cheat days.
Yeah,
for the
cheat
diet
days.
thing.
It could be. I don't know. I've been wearing the same Nike tracksuit pants every third day for about 3 months now, so I'm not going to buy any more of them.
Yeah, I'll pass that on, Nick. There'll be an uproar in the next quarterly meeting because Nickolai's not planning on revenge spending.
Yeah, mate, they're going to send you like a load of bonus pairs in the mail just to amp you up again.
I don't go outside anymore either, so no one will notice.
And on that note, I think we can actually move on to a similar subject to this, where we've had over the last week especially, though this has been something that's we've been observing for a fair bit longer than that, there's been a huge amount of speculative activity from people using the trading app Robinhood in the States. And most of these are youngsters, and it would appear to be that because they can't spend money on some of the things that they would normally spend money on, as someone in their 20s or whatever, that they've decided to start gambling on the stock market. And so you've seen these gigantic rallies in bankrupt companies and all manner of other speculative tech stocks, especially. But it's not just been tech stocks, of course. But that maybe that's sort of an outlet for some of this revenge spending in the meantime, before people can actually go outside and start buying the things that they'd normally be buying. Now, I mean, what do you fellas think of that? Do you think that some of the incredibly speculative activity that we've seen over the past week with bankrupt companies like Hertz jumping very high, do you think that might have something to do with just the fact that people are stuck inside and they can't spend money on the normal things they spend, so they just want to buy stocks?
Yeah, I
think
that's
investing.
Revenge investing, revenge on Buffett. Yeah, I think that's absolutely. I think through this whole rally, there has been a sort of semblance, and you read these articles more from America than from here, of people saying, yeah, I got that $1,200 check, and it's just felt like free money, and they don't have anything else to spend it on. And so like that logical jump for them seemed quite reasonable, that I've just been given some free money, so I might as well do a bit of speculating, a bit of gambling, essentially. And throughout this period, there's people been at home who are still getting paid in the UK on the furlough scheme. And what else are you going to do with it?
Yeah, this might actually explain why our promotion on 5G is selling quite so well. It's a bunch of 14-year-olds who are interested in 5G buying our Frontier Tech Investor newsletter.
We finally cracked the lower age groups.
I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens when Robinhood is released in the UK, because that's been in the works for quite a few months now, and it's yet to be launched here. If the last time I checked, anyway, they had like a sign up wait list and whatnot. I would be very interesting to know if if when Robinhood arrives here, if we'll see any kind of similar phenomenon occur in the FTSE and in the AIM stocks. Though, at the same time, Robinhood will give access to all the US stocks, and maybe the money from British speculative millennials will just flow into the US market. What do you guys think of that?
Does the UK really have the same type of stocks though? But if those young investors with cash to burn, as we keep saying, are going to look for something to invest in that they know, does the UK have those types of stocks with that sort of recognition? And the other thing that I question is the stocks that they have been piling into in the US, at least the ones that I've seen, have not been the ones that you would expect. It's been the like of Hertz and Chesapeake Energy, and a bunch of stocks that have no sort of natural, obvious attraction to younger investors on Robinhood. And so the speculative excesses, which were punished severely yesterday, have been in places that I can't quite explain yet. I have no theory that can explain what's going on there. I don't know what could possibly possess a bunch of young people to invest in a bankrupt company.
Well, they have. It's not just been Chesapeake, the fracker, and Hertz, the rental companies. I mean, one of the sort of the more obvious ones was simply buying the airlines. So you had a gigantic rally in the Jets ETF, which is just sort of a passive airline ETF, just tracks an index of all the airlines. I think especially in the States, and that got a big rally because there was loads of Robinhood money went into it. And I think for something like that, I mean, I think that really does tie into that revenge spending aspect of it, because I think the of people, youngsters love millennial youngsters. It's almost like a stereotype, like to travel. So, and I think a lot of youngsters realize that there's still going to be a lot of appetite for traveling, at least amongst other youngsters. So, if you're afraid of getting the Wu flu, then especially if you're older, or if you have other illnesses, I mean, you're going to be a lot more wary of flying and being away from that kind of environment where you would be in close proximity to other people, etc. But if you're a youngster, then you're far less likely to be severely negatively afflicted by the virus. So I think my sort of theory on that is that I think the youngsters know that there's going to be a lot of what we would call revenge spending, or when it comes simply to traveling. And as a result, they're like, well, the airlines are actually going to do really well out of that. And that's one of the reasons they've been buying it. I could be completely wrong, but that's a lot of people have been wondering about why there has been this big surge in buying of the airlines, especially after Warren Buffett sold them. And so much of that has come from Robinhood. I think it's because youngsters know that the airlines are going to get a lot of business, at least from other youngsters. But we'll have to wait and see how that turns out.
It ties in quite nicely with the fact that they're all spending their time protesting in big groups as well. They're obviously just gambling that coronavirus will not come back and that they will be able to travel. And they're definitely willing to if they're willing to go to a protest together.
Yeah, well, one of the other sort of themes of the last few years has been that, the big mega speculative bull markets, if you think of things like cryptocurrency or the cannabis boom that was a couple of years ago, that was a really big deal. And now, it's obviously what I work on, but we're seeing huge upsurge in renewable energy stocks. And sort of those are three big themes that are very sort of millennial pro-focused. They're sort of young people's ideas, which is renewable energy, cannabis, the legalization of cannabis, cryptocurrency, the future of banking, those kind of things. Those big speculative manias have come. Tesla as well is obviously a classic example of that. It's the sort of young people stocks that have been getting really, really wound up, and just showing less idea of over exuberance. Yeah, so compared to sort of more seasoned investors who've seen these things rise and fall before, that inhibition you learn when you've bought at the top and been absolutely nailed, that has to happen once before you learn your lesson. And, it's happened, Boaz, you mentioned Tesla this week in your editorial. It's an incredible thing how high it's gone. And it was the same with cannabis and crypto. And now it's the same with the airlines.
What's next, Kit? What's the next millennial investment trend?
The next millennial
Protest stocks.
Riot gear. I think Kit's onto something actually with the millennial fads and the investment trends that seem to match up with them. There could be something to that. I wonder what would be next. What else they're really on the bandwagon together with. What else they could make move with their own money. At least it is their own money that they're making markets move with.
That's part of it that I find actually kind of it kind of confuses me a little because the generational wealth gap is still so extreme between generations. So the millennials really don't have that much money relative to the boomer retail investor. So why is it that these millennial favored stocks are managing to move as much as they are when millennials don't really have nearly so much money? I mean, does that speak to an issue of liquidity in the market? I maybe, especially for some of these tech stocks, which are really quite small. But that is something that I can't quite work out with why it is that these stocks have managed to move so much when, we've been writing about, which plenty of other firms have. There's that great generational wealth gap. But moving on a little from there is one thing that I saw in the news this week that I think is really quite important, or it may prove to be very important as time goes on, depending on whether or not this proposal actually goes forward. But is the creation of the largest trash can in Europe. Effectively, the Eurocrats are proposing that a bad bank be created where they can finally flush all of the non-performing loans, all of the bad debt in the Eurozone into, and it can then, deal with the problem backed by the Eurozone government, effectively. So this was a plan that was covered in Reuters earlier. It was, I believe, ECB spokespersons and a few other, I think, from the European Stability Mechanism as well. And the proposal is, well, you create this bad bank. All of the commercial banks in Europe, all the European banks that have been, just absolutely destroyed year after year, and especially now, can finally give their portfolios of bad loans to this bad bank in exchange for bonds issued by the bad bank. So it's effectively a debt for debt swap. So you end up, instead of being owed money from European debtors who have defaulted on them or haven't been paying them for a very long time, you are now owed money by a bad bank which has the backing of the ESM. So it has the backing of the European Stability Mechanism, which is itself capitalized by the Eurozone government. So you're swapping, chicken manure for chicken salad, as some might say. And in doing so, once you've got that debt from the bad bank, you can then take it to the European Central Bank and then use that as collateral to borrow more money. And so this is the latest plan. My idea for what we should name the bad bank would be Garbage Sons. Though I would be interested to know if you guys have any different suggestions for that. Do you think Garbage Sons is good enough, or you should have a maybe slightly grander name?
I'm so speechless. I can't believe that you can use it as collateral to get more funding. I didn't know that last bit. That's just extraordinary. Yeah,
the icing on the cake.
It's Garbage Sons squared for me.
Yeah, have you any ideas?
Not for a name, although I look forward to having a little think about it. James and I have been looking at a lot of waste to energy companies, but this is waste to a very different kind of thing. One thing I wanted to ask, because this is obviously all ongoing, and Nickolai, you write so compellingly about the problems with the unified currency that is the euro, because you have different economies with different needs under the same policy. But I realize I know nothing about how the US dollar functions in terms of, all the states must be so incredibly different. They have some are mining economies, some are financial centers. Did they ever have different currencies in America? How are they, if so, how are they unified? And how have they managed to convince, presumably the taxation of certain states, most of it goes elsewhere. How have Americans been convinced to swallow that? And do you think that is a currency union that could ever come under the same strains as the euro?
Yeah, short answer is it took a civil war. That was hugely driven by economic factors, not just the slavery issue. There's the attempt from the northern, more populous states to support their own economies at the expense of the southern states. And obviously the southern states were wealthy based on slavery. That's how the slavery issue came into it, and they issued their own currencies. The southern states were a confederation. The idea being that states' rights and states' consent to be part of the group was the key. And the North wanted the country to be a union, to be one country. So it's a suspiciously similar story. But the key with the US is that you can move around the country incredibly easy. So the economies are constantly self-adjusting. And that is only true in the Eurozone to a great extent for the wealthy, educated, elite, however you want to class them, the successful and the young. And that's part of why the Euroscepticism is driven by a different demographic inside the UK to the Euro. It's the people that were left behind, the young people who can't find jobs. They're very Eurosceptic, and obviously the nationalists as well. So there is a huge problem in the US where some economies in some states struggle severely at different times, but they are willing to put up with it. There's a lot of fiscal transfers, as Boaz has pointed out in the past. So if you're in Virginia, you're willing to put up with your economy. So I should say West Virginia, you're willing to put up with your economy struggling if you're also getting fiscal transfers from New York to pay for the welfare that is required to keep living standards relatively high. You don't have those fiscal transfers yet in the Eurozone, so there's divergence over time. And last but not least, historically speaking, the Italians and the Greeks have relied on devaluation of their currency to fix what is an institutional problem, the type of politics that they run on. That's why Greece and Italy historically have been the ones to break out of common currencies in Europe first, going back more than a few hundred years. It's always been Greece and Italy that break. So they rely on that devaluation consistently, and nobody in the US has that same culture. You've also got the issue that the states in the US, I believe, must run balanced budgets. They have constitutional requirements, and within a lot of states at least, to run balanced budgets. So, and then you've also got issues about whether the federal government can bail out the state governments. So there are, it's a long list of reasons is the answer, but the similarities are really important too.
Yeah, I think I would maybe add slightly to that. I mean, you do say it is very easy to travel around throughout the US. Maybe if you're in Alaska and Hawaii, there might be some exceptions made there. But what I find key to that, of course, you have the fiscal transfers being a big part of why the US can remain one entity within it, while, as Kit, you described, there are such huge divergences between the individual economies of each state. But the reason why those fiscal transfers, why that government redistribution of wealth is tolerated within the US is, from my perspective at least, due to the fact that, there is an American identity, right? So, everyone like that, you could be from Utah, you could be from Idaho, you could be from Hawaii, you could be from Alaska, but there is still an American identity. And it's very hard, to, create an identity like that. But it is still something that is felt by all the people in those areas, or at least by the majority of people in those areas. And because there is an American identity, they are willing to sustain grand fiscal transfer within the Union of States. And you do not have that in the Eurozone. The Eurozone would not have any real the Eurozone debt crisis and all the problems it has experienced since would not really have any of the problems that it has had if there was a European identity. And all of the Europhiles like to proclaim that there is one, but there evidently is not, because if there was, then the Germans would be very happy to bail out Southern Europe and say, okay, they made a mistake, but we're all in this together, and so we're going to bail each other out. That is not, that obviously hasn't happened. It's one of the big things that everybody is expecting to happen, and it still hasn't really. And it's not that way in the States. And you can even you can bring this home to the UK as well, where we have Northern Ireland, we've got Wales, we've got Scotland and England, and there is still a British identity tying them all together. Yes, there's a big rise in nationalism, not just in Scotland, but there is still a British identity that allows us to do this grand fiscal transfer, where England is bailing out Scotland all the time. I mean, Scotland runs an absolutely ridiculous fiscal deficit, but is subsidized by the much richer England because, well, we're all in this together. I mean, there's still a British identity which facilitates that. And that's something that Europe, I don't see can happen, or at least can happen very, very quick enough to save the Eurozone as it currently is, at least. But it all begins with identity. If there is a shared identity, then you can do all these fiscal transfers and the like. But I think until that arrives, you're gonna just end up with all these interesting sort of papering of the cracks ideas, where you create a gigantic trash can and try to put all the debts there in one place. I mean, Nickolai, what do you think of that? Because I know you have a quite different view on sort of the role of identities and national identities and patriotism and things like that.
I agree with all of it, apart from the first thing you said about Alaska and Hawaii. I think if you look at who works in Alaska and Hawaii, it's going to be a huge proportion of people from the rest of the USA. And that move to those places has been seamless. If you try and move inside Europe, it's far from seamless at the moment. I can't really relate to the ideas of national identity anywhere near as much as perhaps you two can, just because my life has been a demonstration of why they're not very helpful and a bit odd. I think my daughter's got 4 different citizenships. I don't feel any affinity for any of them, for my own one. So that part of it seems a bit odd to me. It's more, I believe, at least for the Germans, the idea that they would be willing to bail out the Italians and the Greeks if the Italians and the Greeks behave like Germans. Now, the Italians and Greeks are not willing to behave like Germans. It doesn't matter the fact that it's like the Germans. What matters is that it's fiscally sustainable and being honest about your statistics and so on and so forth. And these are all stereotypes that don't hold true completely, but they do have a large effect, as you can see from Germany's debt to GDP going into this crisis. So the big issue right now is the Germans feel more vindicated than ever right now, because they've got a low debt to GDP that allows them to spend huge on stimulus, because they've been prudent in the past. Now, the Italians and the Greeks are saying this is Europe's moment. This is when the Germans are going to have to bail us out, because if they don't, the whole thing falls apart. So, it's like a Mexican standoff where both sides think they've got the bullet and the other one doesn't.
Yeah, well, I suppose the reason I asked the question, and I'm glad I mentioned it, because as I say, you both speak so compellingly about it and know far more than me. I just find myself wondering that, the pace of things now feels so different than when you look back 150 years. I just wonder what it would have felt like being in America as the United States of America was sort of becoming formed. There must have been these same divisions between, East and West and North and South, obviously, but state to state as well. And it must have just been a very long, slow process of grinding political will that just slowly forged that identity. I mean, I know we've had the European Union for about 50 years now, and it feels at least more united than it was when it was created. So I just find myself wondering, with enough political will, can something like that be forged over a matter of 100 years rather than 10 years?
Well, keep in mind the American nation was forged in a war against Britain. So it's the exit of its age, the colonial exit. What's that called? The Kexit, away from the Union of the UK. So they had
without a deal, no less.
Without a deal, that's right. Let alone a deal. So they were formed with a small number of states, and the big issue at the time was this is actually the reason I haven't gone to see the musical Hamilton. Apart from the lockdown. But I never went to see the musical Hamilton, because it was the idea of Hamilton versus Jefferson, the idea of should the states be powerful and only united on a very small number of issues, which is similar to what the EU has today, or should the federal government be extremely powerful and rule over the states? That was Hamilton, and the first one was Jefferson's view. and Hamilton effectively won over time. And then, America was colonized after that. A lot of the states came along after that. So the identity of the states on the East Coast spread to the West. So that's another reason why the American identity is fairly consistent across the countries, because the country was colonized over time by a small number of states initially in the East. You've also got to remember that the US was a complete mix of different nationalities. So the national language was almost German. And those didn't really stick together. It was a melting pot, not a salad, as they say. There was a big mixing of cultures. So these were people who were escaping the problems that we see in the Eurozone now. It's the nationalism and the interference from government. So if ever there was an opportunity to form a union, everything was perfectly in place for the US. Whereas in Europe, it's hundreds of years of wars and strife and national borders and national cultural identities and very different systems of government and regulation. If you just research any particular issue on which the Eurozone is having trouble. So, for example, German banks function extremely differently to the rest of the Eurozone's banks. And they were set up in a completely different way, which means when the Eurozone proposes banking legislation to apply across the Eurozone, it just doesn't work. Because the German banking system just could not function under those regulations. They don't even work, apply properly. So that's the sort of issue that wouldn't have happened in the US because they didn't have a banking system. They had to create one. And it was a very different starting point.
All right, gents, I'm afraid our time is up for today. This has been a very interesting conversation indeed. Nickolai, do you have any closing remarks for our listeners over the weekend?
No, but I'm going to be spending a lot of time looking at this bad bank now that you've told me so much about the bits that I didn't know.
Yeah, and to anyone listening, actually, if you have any suggestions as to what the best name for this bad bank would be, do send me an email. It's boaz@southbankresearch.com. My proposal is Garbage Sons, but we are open to other names. Kit, do you have any closing remarks for the day?
No, I'll leave it there, Boaz.
Indeed. And that is all for this week from our market broadcast. We shall be back again next week. In the meantime, if you'd like to follow any of us on Twitter, all three of us do have Twitter accounts. If you just search for Nickolai Hubble, Kit Winder, or Boaz Shoshan, you shall be able to find us. But I hope you have a very good weekend, and we'll see you next time.